Sometimes the hardest goodbye is the one that hasn't happened yet. I didn't notice the envelope at first. It was tucked beneath Noah's coffee mug on our tiny kitchen table, the same scarred wooden table we'd rescued from a thrift store 2 years ago, because neither of us could afford anything better. Morning sunlight spilled through the apartment windows, catching the edge of a crisp stack of papers that looked far too official for a lazy Saturday. I reached over to move them aside so I could wipe up the coffee ring he'd inevitably left behind, but then I saw his name. Noah Carter. Apartment lease agreement. My smile disappeared before I even realized I'd been smiling. I wasn't trying to snoop. Honestly, I wasn't. But when you share 700 square feet with another person for almost 3 years, your lives naturally blur together. Bills sat in the same drawer. Groceries ended up on the same shelves. Our jackets hung from the same rack beside the front door. There had never been a reason to keep secrets. Until now. My fingers hovered over the edge of the document without touching it again. The address wasn't ours. Different neighborhood. Different building. Different life. A quiet laugh drifted down the hallway. Noah was humming to himself while getting ready for work, completely unaware that my entire morning had just tilted sideways. "You okay?" he called. I cleared my throat before answering. "Yeah. Just trying to figure out who keeps buying expired milk." "Definitely you." His voice carried that familiar teasing warmth that somehow made every ordinary day feel lighter. "I literally watched you sniff the carton yesterday." "Quality control," I shot back automatically. "I'm protecting us." He stepped into the kitchen, tie hanging loose around his neck, sleeves rolled halfway to his elbows. His dark hair was still damp from the shower, and he looked exactly like every normal Saturday morning we'd ever shared. That was the problem. Everything looked the same except nothing was. He reached for his travel mug without noticing the lease beneath it. Or maybe he noticed and assumed I hadn't. "I'll be home late," he said while grabbing his keys. "Team dinner. After work." "Sounds fun." "Not really." He smiled anyway. "Save me some pizza?" "Only if you deserve it." "I always deserve pizza." He bumped my shoulder as he walked past, a habit so ordinary neither of us thought about it anymore. Then he opened the door, paused for half a second like he wanted to say something else, and settled for, "See you tonight, Ethan." The apartment fell strangely quiet after he left. The silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with questions. How long had he been planning this? Had he signed already? Was this why he'd been cleaning out closets one drawer at a time? Why he donated old clothes last week? Why he kept checking his phone with that thoughtful expression I could never quite read? I looked around the apartment we'd accidentally turned into a home. The crooked movie posters. The dying succulent Noah insisted was just resting. The stack of board games neither of us had finished. Every corner held some version of us. I had always assumed we were building something together, even if I'd never been brave enough to admit what I secretly wished that something could become. Maybe I had mistaken comfort for permanence. Maybe roommates were always meant to become memories. But as I stared at the unfamiliar address printed beneath Noah's name, one impossible thought refused to leave me alone. Maybe I wasn't losing an apartment. Maybe I was about to lose the person who had quietly become my favorite part of every single day. The next morning, I woke up determined to prove that I had imagined everything. Maybe the lease belonged to a coworker. Maybe Noah was helping someone move. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that did not involve my entire life quietly falling apart. Denial was surprisingly comfortable until reality decided to interrupt it. Noah was already in the kitchen flipping pancakes with the same effortless confidence he somehow applied to everything from cooking breakfast to assembling furniture without reading the instructions. The apartment smelled like butter and maple syrup, and for one blissful second, it felt like every other Sunday we had ever shared. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Good. You are awake. I was about to eat your share. You say that every week. One of these days I will mean it." I poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping the mug would give my hands something to do besides shake. Noah slid a plate onto the table and sat across from me. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Forks scraped against ceramic while an old jazz playlist drifted softly from the speaker by the window. Then his phone buzzed. He picked it up, read the message, and exhaled slowly. "I guess there is no perfect way to say this," he murmured. My stomach tightened before he even looked at me. "Say what?" His blue eyes met mine, calm but uncertain. I accepted the position in Seattle. Every sound in the apartment seemed to disappear. Even the music faded into nothing. It is a great opportunity, he continued carefully. Better pay. Bigger company. They want me there next week. Next week. Not next month. Not someday. 7 days. I forced a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. That is amazing, Noah. He searched my face as though trying to decide whether I actually meant it. You are not mad? Why would I be? Because I should have told you sooner. I shrugged, pretending my heartbeat was not pounding in my ears. You have to do what is best for you. The words tasted hollow the moment they left my mouth. Noah nodded slowly, but he did not look relieved. If anything, he looked disappointed. I was worried this would change things between us. I laughed quietly, the kind of laugh people make when they are trying very hard not to feel something. It is only a different zip code. He smiled, but it barely reached his eyes. After breakfast, we cleaned the kitchen together and practiced silence. He washed. I dried. We passed plates back and forth with the kind of coordination that only came from years of living side by side. It struck me that we never had to ask where anything belonged anymore. We simply knew. Every cabinet, every drawer, every habit, every little piece of each other. Before leaving for the grocery store, Noah grabbed a small notebook from the counter. I made a list, he said. 7 things we always talked about doing before one of us moved. Away someday. I blinked. You actually kept that? Of course. He grinned, though there was sadness hiding underneath it. Road trip to the lake. Outdoor movie night. Try that barbecue place everyone keeps recommending. Beat you at mini golf at least once. That last one is impossible. We have 7 days for me to prove you wrong. I looked at the handwritten list, then back at him. Somewhere between pancakes, quiet smiles, and a notebook filled with forgotten promises, I realized the countdown had already begun. Every ordinary moment from now on would also be the last time we shared it together. Monday arrived much faster than I wanted it to. There were 6 days left now, and somehow the apartment already felt different. Nothing had actually changed. Noah still left his sneakers in the middle of the hallway like they were decorative furniture. I still complained every single time before moving them 3 feet closer to the wall. The coffee maker still made that strange clicking noise every morning, and the ancient refrigerator still hummed like it was trying to sing itself back to life. Everything looked exactly the same, yet every familiar detail carried an invisible expiration date. That afternoon, Noah texted me while I was finishing work. Meet me downstairs at 6. Comfortable shoes. I replied with a single question mark. He answered with, trust me. That should have worried me. It usually meant he had another one of his spontaneous ideas. At exactly 6 o'clock, he was leaning against his old blue sedan with 2 paper cups of iced coffee waiting in the cup holders. Where are we going? I asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. Item number 1. He tapped the notebook resting on the dashboard. We always said we would spend an entire evening exploring every weird little shop downtown instead of rushing through them. I laughed. That was your idea. And you agreed. I was hungry. You bribed me with tacos. Still counts. We wandered through bookstores that smelled like aging paper and fresh coffee, antique shops filled with furniture older than both of us combined, and a tiny record store where Noah insisted on playing songs that made absolutely no sense. At one point, he found a ridiculously oversized cowboy hat and placed it on my head before stepping back with folded arms. You look like someone who gives weather reports at a rodeo. Take the picture and get it over with, I sighed. He laughed so hard that other customers turned to look. That sound had always been my favorite. Not because it was loud, but because it was impossible to fake. As the evening stretched on, we stopped pretending we were shopping and simply started walking. The sidewalks glowed beneath strings of warm lights, and people drifted in and out of restaurants carrying shopping bags and laughing with friends. Noah suddenly slowed in front of a small photo booth tucked beside an old movie theater. Remember this? He asked. The machine that stole $5 from us. It also gave us the worst picture ever taken. Exactly. He pulled another $5 bill from his wallet. Redemption. Before I could protest, he was already dragging me inside. The curtain closed behind us, and we squeezed shoulder to shoulder onto the narrow bench. Smile, Noah said. The flash went off. Then another. On the third picture, he looked at me instead of the camera. I noticed too late, turning instinctively toward him just as the final flash captured both of us laughing for no reason at all. When the strip printed a minute later, we stood there quietly studying the tiny photographs. In every picture we looked comfortable, familiar, completely unaware that time had suddenly become something precious. Noah carefully slipped the photo strip into his wallet instead of handing me a copy. "You are keeping those?" I asked. He nodded without looking up. "Some memories are too important to lose." For a second, I almost asked him the question that had been trapped in my chest ever since I found the lease. If these moments mattered so much, then why was he leaving them behind? The words reached the edge of my lips before fear quietly pushed them back down again. Instead, I smiled, bumped his shoulder the way he always bumped mine, and followed him toward the parking lot, pretending that 6 days still sounded like a very long time. Tuesday greeted us with dark clouds hanging low over the city, the kind that promised rain before lunchtime and delivered on that promise with impressive dedication. By the time I finished work, the streets shimmered beneath steady sheets of water, and my phone buzzed with a message from Noah. "Power is out in our building. Pick up candles if you pass a store." I smiled before I realized I was smiling. Somehow, even a blackout had become another shared adventure. I stopped at a neighborhood market and grabbed a pack of vanilla candles, 2 flashlights, and a bag of microwave popcorn that immediately became useless the moment I remembered the microwave would not exactly cooperate without electricity. When I pushed open the apartment door, the familiar hallway was lit only by the soft glow of candlelight. Noah looked up from the living room floor where he was attempting to build what appeared to be the world's most unstable blanket fort. "Finally," he announced dramatically, "my structural engineer has arrived." I set the grocery bag down and stared at the crooked masterpiece. This thing would not survive a gentle sneeze. "That is why I hired you." 20 minutes later, after a surprising amount of teamwork and entirely unnecessary debate about blanket placement, we ended up sitting inside a surprisingly cozy little shelter surrounded by flickering candles. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere across the city. Without television, laptops, or phones competing for attention, the apartment felt quieter than it had in years. Noah leaned back against the couch cushion and pulled a deck of cards from one of the storage bins. "Loser answers one honest question." I narrowed my eyes. "You made that rule up?" "Absolutely. We played for nearly an hour." He asked harmless questions at first. "Favorite childhood vacation? Worst haircut? Most embarrassing high school memory?" I reminded him of the time he accidentally wore 2 different sneakers to an internship interview. He reminded me that I once confidently waved at a stranger for an entire traffic light because I thought it was my cousin. We laughed until my stomach hurt. Then, somewhere, between another clap of thunder and another hand of cards, everything slowed. Noah placed his final card on the blanket and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Truth question," he said quietly. "No escaping." "Fine." He hesitated longer than usual. "Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you planned because of a person?" The room suddenly felt much smaller. Candlelight danced across his face, softening every familiar feature I had spent years pretending not to notice too carefully. I forced a casual shrug that fooled neither of us. "Maybe." He nodded slowly, eyes lowering to the cards scattered between us. "Me too." Silence settled over us, not awkward, just impossibly full. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Noah opened his mouth as though he wanted to continue. His hand shifted slightly across the blanket, stopping only inches from mine. I could almost feel the warmth without either of us moving another inch. Then, just as the moment stretched to the edge of becoming something neither of us could take back, every light in the apartment suddenly blazed to life. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the stove began flashing 12 o'clock. Noah blinked, leaned back, and laughed under his breath. Perfect timing. I smiled because it seemed easier than admitting how disappointed I felt. We folded the blankets, blew out the candles one by one, and returned the living room to normal. Yet as I watched Noah disappear into the kitchen to reset the appliances, I could not shake the feeling that the darkness had almost given us the courage that daylight kept stealing away. Wednesday afternoon arrived with clear skies, as if the storm had quietly packed its bags and moved somewhere else. There were 4 days left. Noah insisted we keep following the notebook, which somehow felt both comforting and cruel. Item number 3 was embarrassingly simple. Try the famous barbecue restaurant across town that we had talked about visiting for nearly 3 years and somehow never found time to visit. We spent 40 minutes waiting for a table, making up ridiculous backstories for strangers in line. Noah, pointed at an older couple sharing a milkshake, and whispered, "Retired spies." I looked at a teenager wearing sunglasses indoors. "Secret pop star trying to stay anonymous." He laughed so hard, he almost dropped the pager the hostess had handed us. Moments like that always came easily with Noah. Silence was easy too. We never had to force conversations. We could simply exist beside each other without the pressure to fill every second with words. Halfway through dinner, someone called Noah's name. A tall woman with curly brown hair and a bright smile walked over carrying a tray. "Noah Carter." "I knew that was you." Noah stood to hug her. "Lily." "Wow. It has been forever." They talked for a few minutes while I quietly focused on rearranging my fries for absolutely no reason. Eventually Noah waved me over. "Ethan, this is Lily. We used to work together." She smiled warmly. "You must be the famous roommate." I blinked. "Famous? He talks about you constantly." Noah rubbed the back of his neck. "Lily." "What?" she asked innocently. "It is true." She turned back to me before Noah could interrupt again. Every Monday, he came to work with another story. Ethan tried making homemade pasta. Ethan convinced me to watch terrible science fiction movies. Ethan somehow keeps every houseplant alive except one cactus. "That cactus betrayed me," I muttered. Lily laughed. "See? Exactly like that." Then she tilted her head thoughtfully. "You know, everyone at the office thought Noah had a crush on someone, but he never told us who." Noah nearly choked on his iced tea. "Lily, I am leaving now," she said with exaggerated surrender, lifting both hands. "Congratulations on Seattle. They are lucky to have you." She walked away before either of us could say another word. Noah stared very intently at the menu as though it had suddenly become fascinating. I cleared my throat. "People thought you liked someone? Office gossip is not exactly reliable." "Maybe not." He gave a small shrug. "It did make declining dates more complicated." I looked up. "Dates?" "A few." He spoke casually, but there was something careful about his voice. "Nothing serious." I frowned. "I did not even know people." "We're asking you out." Noah smiled without meeting my eyes. "That is because I usually said no before mentioning it." "Why?" The question escaped before I could stop it. He finally looked at me, and for a brief second something vulnerable flickered across his face. I guess I was waiting for someone who never realized I was waiting. Before I could ask what he meant, the server arrived with the check, and the moment quietly folded itself away like a letter slipped back into an envelope. On the drive home, neither of us turned on the radio. The silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a single impossible thought that refused to leave me alone. What if the person Noah had been waiting for had been sitting across the breakfast table from him every single morning for the last 3 years, without ever understanding the story unfolding right in front of him? Thursday morning began with cardboard boxes. They appeared in the living room one by one, stacked neatly against the wall like silent reminders that time never slowed down just because someone wished it would. Noah had borrowed them from work, and together we started packing the things he would not need over the next few days. Books he had already finished reading. Winter coats in the middle of spring. Decorative mugs that somehow survived 3 years without either of us dropping one. We worked side by side with music playing softly in the background, neither of us saying much. Every now and then one of us would hold up a random object and a memory would immediately follow. A chipped coffee mug from our first apartment. The board game we never managed to finish because every match ended in laughter instead of competition. A faded baseball cap Noah bought during a road trip that somehow became his favorite even though he insisted it was ugly. Around lunchtime, I opened the hall closet looking for packing tape and noticed a small storage box pushed all the way to the back. It had Noah's handwriting across the lid. "Miscellaneous. Can I move this one?" I called. "Sure," he answered from the bedroom. I honestly forgot what is even inside. I carried it into the living room and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of little things wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Ticket stubs from movies. Receipts from restaurants. A tiny plastic dinosaur that had once come from a children's meal after I jokingly claimed I deserved a prize for surviving a terrible work week. Beneath those was a navy blue scarf still folded exactly the way it would have looked in a department store. I frowned. "Noah." He walked over, wiping dust from his hands. The moment he saw the open box, all the color seemed to leave his face. "You were not supposed to find that yet." I picked up the scarf. "It still has the price tag." He looked away with a quiet laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. I bought that during our first winter here. 3 years ago? He nodded. You kept saying your old scarf was falling apart. Then why did you never give it to me? His shoulders rose in a helpless shrug. Because every time I planned to, it felt too personal. Then it became awkward. After that, it just stayed in the box. I reached for another item. A hardcover novel by my favorite author. Still wrapped in plastic. A sketchbook with expensive paper. A coffee mug with a ridiculous cartoon raccoon that looked exactly like something I would buy for myself. Every single thing reflected some tiny conversation we had shared over the years. These are all for me? I asked quietly. Noah nodded once. Birthdays. Promotions. Bad days. Good days. Random Tuesdays. I stared at the collection in disbelief. Why would you buy gifts and never give them? He smiled sadly, folding the empty tissue paper between his fingers. Because after a while they stopped feeling like gifts between roommates. He finally looked directly at me, and there was no hiding behind jokes anymore. I was afraid they would reveal too much. The apartment became impossibly still. Outside, someone laughed in the parking lot. A delivery truck rolled past. Ordinary life continued as though nothing extraordinary had just happened inside our little home. Noah took a slow breath. I accepted the Seattle job because I convinced myself you would never look at me the way I looked at you. Staying here every day was becoming harder. Then leaving. My heart seemed to forget how to beat. For 3 years I had believed I was protecting our friendship by keeping quiet. Standing there surrounded by unopened gifts meant for me. I realized we had both been carrying the exact same secret, each believing silence was the kinder choice. Friday arrived before either of us was ready for it. 3 days had somehow become 2, and the apartment no longer sounded like home. It sounded like packing tape, cardboard sliding across hardwood floors, and the soft zip of suitcases that kept reminding me every minute mattered now. Neither Noah nor I mentioned what he had confessed the day before. Maybe we were both afraid that saying the words again would make them too real to survive. Instead, we did what we always did when life became overwhelming. We cleaned. Noah vacuumed while I sorted books on his shelves that would soon belong to only one person. Every few minutes we bumped into each other in the narrow hallway, apologizing with awkward smiles that somehow felt more intimate than any dramatic declaration could have. Around noon, Noah disappeared into his room and returned holding the old notebook. There is still one thing left before tomorrow, he said quietly. Mini golf. I guessed. He nodded. We cannot leave the competition unfinished. 40 minutes later, we were standing beneath colorful lights at the same miniature golf course where we had gone on a random Saturday almost 2 years earlier. Back then, we had laughed so hard that we accidentally held up the group behind us. Today, the course looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. Noah insisted on keeping score with exaggerated seriousness, celebrating every lucky bounce as though he had just won a championship. I accused him of distracting me on purpose. He claimed psychological strategy was a legitimate athletic skill. By the final hole, we were tied. Winner buys ice cream, Noah announced. That was not the deal. It is now. I lined up my shot, took a deep breath, and somehow sent the ball straight into the tiny windmill instead of the hole. Noah laughed so hard, he had to lean on his putter for balance. Then he stepped beside me, gently adjusted the angle of the club in my hands, and said, "Try again. Slower this time." His fingers rested only briefly against mine before he stepped back. It was the smallest touch imaginable, yet my heart reacted as though the entire world had shifted a few inches. I sank the shot. "See," he said with a grin. "You always overthink things." We bought 2 cones anyway because neither of us could remember who had officially won. We sat on a wooden bench overlooking a small pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. Children chased bubbles nearby, while the evening sun painted everything in warm shades of gold. Noah quietly broke the silence first. "Do you remember the day we met?" I smiled without thinking. "You carried 4 boxes up 3 flights of stairs because I dropped one and refused to admit I needed help. You also tried to pay me with half of a frozen pizza. It was a good pizza." He laughed softly, then his expression grew thoughtful. "I think I started falling for you that day." I looked down at the melting ice cream in my hands. "You know what the funny part is?" He shook his head. "I almost told you that same week that moving in with you already felt like the best decision I had ever made." I stopped because I thought it sounded ridiculous. Noah stared at me without speaking. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh grass between us. Finally, I found the courage I had spent 3 years searching for. You were never the only one keeping a secret, Noah. I have loved you for so long that I honestly cannot remember what it felt like before you became my favorite part of every ordinary day. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then Noah smiled, not with surprise, but with quiet relief, like someone who had finally reached home after believing he had been lost all along. Saturday morning arrived too quietly. Sunlight slipped through the blinds exactly the way it had every weekend since we moved in together, but nothing about the apartment felt ordinary anymore. The confession from the night before had not made things awkward the way I had feared. Somehow it had done the opposite. We moved around each other with the same familiar rhythm. Only now, every smile carried the relief of finally being understood. Noah brewed coffee while humming softly. I stood beside him making pancakes, and every now and then our shoulders brushed in the narrow kitchen. Neither of us apologized anymore. We simply smiled and kept cooking. It should have been the happiest morning of my life. Instead, the packed suitcases by the front door kept pulling my attention back to reality. Love had finally found its voice, but the clock had never stopped counting down. After breakfast, Noah sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees. I called my manager this morning, he said. My heart immediately skipped. About what? I asked whether I could delay my start date. Hope flared so suddenly that it almost hurt. And he shook his head with a tired smile. They said no. They have already assigned my projects. If I do not arrive on Monday, the offer disappears. Silence settled between us. I nodded slowly, trying very hard to be the version of myself who always supported his dreams. Then you have to go. Noah looked at me as though I had just said the one thing he did not want to hear. Do I? You worked for this opportunity. I worked for a future. He stood and walked toward the window, staring down at the parking lot below. I just never imagined that future without you would feel this empty. I joined him, standing close enough that our reflections blended together in the glass. I am not asking you to give up your career. And I am not asking you to pretend this does not matter. We stayed there for a long moment, watching strangers carry groceries, walk their dogs, and live perfectly ordinary Saturdays, while ours felt balanced on the edge of a decision neither of us wanted to make. Finally, Noah laughed quietly. 3 years. We wasted 3 years because we were both convinced the other one did not feel the same way. We were spectacularly bad at communicating. Embarrassingly bad. I smiled despite everything. Almost impressive, honestly. He turned toward me, his expression growing serious again. If I leave tomorrow, I do not want us to become one of those stories people tell themselves about the person they almost loved. I looked down at the floor before answering. Then do not let me become an almost. His eyes searched mine, waiting. My heartbeat was loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. Go to Seattle if you still believe it is where your future begins, I said carefully. But do not go because you think I never wanted you to stay. I want you. I have wanted you for longer than I knew how to admit. If you walk out that door tomorrow, make sure it is because it is truly your dream and not because you were trying to protect yourself from a heartbreak that never had to happen. Noah closed the distance between us and gently took my hand, his fingers fitting naturally with mine as though they had always belonged there. He smiled through eyes shining with quiet emotion. For the first time in 3 years, he whispered, I finally know exactly what I have been fighting for. I just need to figure out whether the place I thought I was chasing is still the place I actually want to call home. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only exists when something important is about to happen. The apartment was almost empty now. The movie posters had been taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the walls where years of memories had once hung. Half the bookshelves stood bare. Noah's suitcases waited neatly by the front door, ready for a journey that suddenly felt much heavier than a flight to another city. Neither of us had slept much. We drank coffee in comfortable silence, occasionally smiling at each other across the kitchen table that had somehow survived 3 years of late-night conversations, burned pancakes, terrible card games, and every ordinary moment that had quietly become extraordinary. Around 9 o'clock, Noah's phone rang. He stepped onto the balcony to answer it while I pretended to wash dishes that were already clean. Through the glass door, I watched him listen more than speak. He nodded once, then twice. Finally, he closed his eyes for a brief second before ending the call. He stood there for another minute, looking out across the neighborhood we had called home. When he came back inside, I searched his face for an answer before he even spoke. That was Seattle, he said softly. My chest tightened. They wanted my final decision. I nodded, unable to trust my own voice. Noah walked to the front door, picked up one of his suitcases, and held it there for a long moment. Then, without saying a word, he set it back down exactly where it had been. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his apartment keys, and placed them on top of the suitcase instead. I stared at him, completely confused. A slow smile spread across his face. I thanked them for believing in me, he said. Then I told them I could not spend the next few years building a career while wondering what would have happened if I had stayed with the person I love. I felt every carefully rehearsed sentence disappear from my mind. You turned it down? He nodded. Jobs come back. Cities change. Opportunities appear again. But I have already spent 3 years almost losing you while we lived in the same apartment. I am not spending another 3,000 miles doing the same thing. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. It was my manager. I almost ignored it until Noah pointed at the screen. You should answer. A few moments later, I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, listening to words I never expected to hear. The company had decided to open a satellite office in Seattle and wanted to know whether I would consider leading the expansion in 3 months. I slowly lowered the phone, looking at Noah in complete disbelief. We both laughed at exactly the same time, not because the situation was funny, but because life had a strange habit of rewarding honesty after years of silence. 3 months suddenly felt very different from tomorrow morning. We had time to plan together instead of running apart. That afternoon, we carried every packed box back into the apartment. The blankets returned to the couch. The photographs went back onto the shelves. The little dinosaur found its place beside the television again. Nothing looked quite the way it had before, yet everything somehow felt more like home. Weeks later, we signed a new lease with both of our names printed across the top of the first page. Not because we were simply roommates anymore, but because we had finally stopped pretending that love needed perfect timing before it deserved to be spoken. Looking back now, I realized the apartment was never the reason I stayed. Home had never been 4 walls, old furniture, or a familiar address. Home had always been the person who made every ordinary day worth remembering. And this time, we were finally brave enough to choose that future together.